The following Frederick W. Reynolds Lecture is a production of Continuing Education at the University of Utah.
Good morning. I'm a little louder than I expected to be. On behalf of Continuing Education and the Office of Engagement here at the University of Utah, I'd like to welcome you to the 63rd Frederick Reynolds Lecture. We're doing some interesting new things this year. We have never done this lecture during the day. We have never brought in a speaker from outside of the university community. And we are bringing in someone who I think will absolutely inspire you as she has inspired me. I want to tell you how we came to know Courtney Martin. Ann Darling, Martha Bradley, Robert Newman and I went to a conference called the Guiding Lights Weekend about a year ago. And we heard Courtney speaking the first night, very briefly in a panel presentation. And Martha and Ann and Robert and I left that presentation and said, my goodness, what an amazing person. And I sure hope we have more opportunities to interact with her throughout the course of the conference. And the next day, how lucky were we that Ann and Marty and I were partnered with Courtney Martin in a small group conversation. And we ended up talking quite intimately about the lives of women and about how they're never quite big enough to fit all the stuff in them. And we left and we walked out of the room and we said, if nothing else happens at this conference but that conversation that we just had, this was worth every moment, every dollar, every time spent, and every bit of energy to get there because she's that kind of person. Since that time, our Beacon Scholars Program has been reading her book, Do It Anyway, and I can promise you that as you learn more about that book today, when you hear from her, that you will see how inspiring Courtney Martin is relative to the difference that we make in the world and how we use our magic to really inspire and connect and be active citizens in this world. So it's such an honor to have her here today. And for those of you who may remember, we had to cancel this lecture, reschedule this lecture due to a massive storm in New York. So I want to say a special thank you to Mother Nature for allowing us to have Courtney here with us today, and also just give Mother Nature a slight punch for not letting us see the gorgeous mountains behind us, because it is really a spectacular view, but today not so much. But we're so glad to have you with us here today, Courtney, and so happy to be sharing this Reynolds Lecture experience with you in a new way, and trying really to be sure that we get students, as many students as possible, here learning from Courtney. She'll be with students all throughout the day. She's had breakfast with the community engaged scholars in the Benyon Center, and we'll be going to the Beacon class after lunch, and then down to the Mestizo Coffee House to work with the Mestizo Arts and Activism students later this afternoon. So lots of opportunities to interact with students. Courtney Martin is pure magic. She is an author, a journalist, a blogger, an amazing human being, a citizen, a thoughtful person who really thinks about her impact and the impact of others. She's a feminist, she's an activist, and she has compassion just coming out of her pores. And I'm so pleased and honored. And if I could, I'd like to dedicate this to Martha Bradley, who couldn't be with us today, who inspires us daily to do it anyway. Courtney Martin.
Man, I want to be introduced by Sandy every day. That is like an amazing way to start out my morning. And I really want to express heartfelt thanks to Sandy. From the minute I met these women, I felt like this relationship was formed. And one of the things that I'll talk about today, but I've been thinking about so much lately, is just that relationship to me is at the heart of everything good and important in the world. And so I give a lot of talks, I travel a lot, and it's very rare that I feel that kind of a deep connection where I'm being brought in that way and in that spirit. And with Sandy, kind of every step of the way has just felt so deeply relationship oriented. So I want to thank her so sincerely, and thank everyone who made it possible for me to come. I know there are lots of different parts of the university involved. So I'm just very grateful to all the energy. And in terms of Mother Nature, I think we can give her a break because I did grow up in Colorado, so I had the great privilege of being around mountains my whole life. So maybe she knew this girl's had her fill of beautiful views. Although I do feel very at home here. It feels a bit like Colorado to me. So I'm very grateful to be here. So as you know, I'm going to talk about doing it. I also didn't know I'm the first outside lecturer, so I feel especially honored. I hope I don't break it for the rest of the people who might come here. So I'm so honored that you took that leap of faith with me, and I know this is a long tradition within the university, so I hope it feels very rooted and contextualized in the work that you all are doing every day. And as Sandy mentioned, I got to spend the morning with a bunch of totally brilliant students, and the conversation was so wide-ranging and so complicated in the best possible way. So I already have this feeling of the kinds of conversations that are going on here around these issues. So I feel very lucky to be a part of those. So I'm going to start with 3 little words. Save the world. Where were you the first time you heard these 3 little words? It's a phrase that has slipped off the tongues of hippie parents and well-intentioned teachers with a sort of cruel ease for the last 3 decades. In evangelical churches and Jewish summer camps, on 321 Contact and Dora the Explorer, even on MTV, we, sort of widely framed as America's youth, have been charged with the vaguest and I would argue most ethically dangerous of responsibilities to, quote, save the world. But what does it really mean? What has it ever really meant when uttered by moms and ministers, by zany aunts and debate coaches, to save the whole wildly complex, horrifically hypocritical, overwhelmingly beautiful world? This book that I'm going to talk to you about today grew out of my struggle with that very question. I felt like I grew up with those 3 little words sort of embedded in everything I ate, everything I consumed, my family, my school. It was really something that I felt like was sort of the water I was swimming in. I went to Barnard College in 2002, which is the all-women's part of Columbia University in New York City. I graduated rather than in 2002, and I sort of walked across the stage high on my own potential. I had taken human rights courses, and I had marched for Mumia, and I had done spoken word poetry in Lower East Side clubs, and I was just totally full of my own potential and all the things I just wanted to unleash on the world. I had a ton of energy, and I was ready to go. And what I quickly realized after walking across that stage was that saving the world was never going to be so simple as I had set it up in my mind. It was never going to be so simple as those classroom conversations or so simple as those moments that I had felt really poised to make, quote, a difference. I got involved in going to grad school. I got this fellowship, so I was going to grad school. I was working part-time at a women's health nonprofit, and you know, I thought nonprofit, that's the way to go, right? I want to save the world, I got to go work in a nonprofit. Well, it turned out that my boss, whose name I wish I could tell you because it's such a wild name, her whole sort of pet project was stroke prevention for women. Which if you know anything about stroke, the #1 thing you can do to prevent stroke is not smoke. And she would sit in this tiny office that I was supposed to share with her, and she would smoke these long, skinny cigarettes as she had these conference calls with doctors working on stroke research. And that was the beginning of my wake-up call, that social change was not as pure as many people led you to believe it was, right? Here was this woman with great intentions, but she's sitting here smoking these long, skinny cigarettes, and I felt totally useless. She would ask me to sort of, you know, send out the end of year donation, and I would sit in front of that computer and try to mail merge and waste like so much paper trying to print the gosh darn envelopes correctly, right? Like we've all been there in those moments where you're like, I thought I was supposed to save the world and all I'm doing is making bad coffee or whatever. So my first nonprofit job was definitely a disillusionment for me. I was also involved in an anti-war demonstration. So I was waking up my friends who were really pissed off at me because we'd been out dancing the night before, and I was saying, we have to go to this protest march. And they're saying, protest marches don't make a difference. I'm like, yes, they do. We have to get there. So I dragged them on the subway, and we get there, and we march. And it's called the Largest Focus Group by our president. So basically they were like, see, we told you, Courtney, it really didn't matter. I was phone banking, I was mentoring, I was like throwing my energy against the wall, basically, trying to figure out what I could do that would make me feel like my own efforts were worthwhile. And then I had this sort of breaking point moment, which I talk about in my TED Talk, and I understand a lot of folks have watched it. The full story of that, which I don't think I tell in the TED Talk, is that I was home for winter break, and my family and I went to see this incredibly depressing documentary called Darwin's Nightmare. Has anyone in here seen it? I'm sorry. I mean, it's good. You want to see it, but you don't want to tell anyone to see it. You know what I'm talking about, because it's so depressing. It's about starvation. And it's a beautifully done documentary, but it's really depressing. And my family is the kind of family that loves to get together and watch depressing documentaries. So this was like the ultimate for us. And we all left. It was literally like the day before Christmas Eve, and we were totally depressed. My mom got her signature sea breeze, and I was drinking a beer with my brother, and I started to just talk about how sad, like how deeply sad I was feeling about the state of the world, and more importantly, my place in it. And I admitted to my mom that I had been reading the New York Times one day and just had this thought of like, what if I just wrote a letter, like an open letter about how screwed up the world is, and then lit myself on fire in the White House steps? Because everyone cares when privileged white girls, when something bad happens to privileged white girls, right? Like, you pay attention to the news, you know if a girl goes missing and she's a privileged white girl, people pay attention. And my mom sort of took a deep breath, took probably a drink of her signature sea breeze and said, I will not stand for that desperation. You are smarter and more resilient than that. And this was coming from a woman who had spent decades trying to make the world better. So hearing that message from her in that sober voice really sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I realized that I was doing what I think a lot of young people do, particularly after we walk across these graduation stages, high on our own potential as I had, which is sort of swinging between this overestimation of ourselves and this underestimation of ourselves. And that the place in between is really the sweet spot, right? But because we've been so raised on our own potential and sort of the hype of the save the world rhetoric, that we get out in the real world and everything falls flat. And so a lot of us experience this disillusion. Wendell Berry, who's a writer I just love, says, despair is the too little of responsibility as pride is the too much. So you might imagine me marching across that stage with the pride of too much and then kind of crashing to the ground with the despair of too little, right? Having convinced myself that nothing I did mattered because I didn't see fireworks or, everything didn't change in an instant. And Martin Seligman calls this learned helplessness, right? When you have these grand expectations and you find them repeatedly unfulfilled over and over, the unavoidable next stop is despair, which we all know is the least productive place to come from, right? It's a place that does not lend itself to what we were talking about earlier of creating relationships. When you're in despair, it's very hard to know your own value or witness the value in others because you just feel that capital D despair, right? So I was humbled. I was sort of called to action by my own mother, and I decided to look to my own stable peers, people who I felt had found more sustainable ways to be engaged citizens for their wisdom. I decided to kind of look around and say, how are other people figuring this out? How are other people figuring out how to land in the middle and not sort of swing to these too little of despair, too much of pride places? So I went on this journey and I met these eight people. 7 of them I literally met. One of them I met in words because she had already passed away. And I looked to each of them to ask this question: how did these people who are my peers wrestle with this idea of, quote, saving the world? So I want to tell you about each of them today briefly and sort of one of the lessons of many that each of them have taught me. The first is Rachel Corrie. She was a fascinating woman whose very young life was cut short at 23 years old. She grew up in Olympia, Washington, and she had parents like I did that really talked a lot about the world and giving back and having compassion for people and paying attention to the structural inequities in the world. And so she was also this really beautiful writer from a very young age, and she wrote these incredible diary entries about her yearning to do something in the world that mattered. One of them that I want to read you really quickly because her words are so powerful is, "This rant is the result of the sinking realization that the best of what we do is mitigation. I can't cool boiling waters in Russia. I can't be Picasso. I can't be Jesus. I can't save the planet single-handedly. I can wash dishes. Thinking it over, I realize that the most powerful action I can take towards societal improvement will have to start very close to home, arising not from the need to leave a mark on history, but from empathy and sincere understanding of the place in my life where neglect exists." I love that phrase, sincere understanding of the place in my life where neglect exists. Now, the deep irony of this beautiful piece of writing that she did is that she actually did the exact opposite in her life. She didn't go close to home. She didn't look at where neglect existed in her own life. She got involved in a peace movement that was taking a delegation of people over to Palestine, an issue which she had no real connection to in terms of her demographic background. And she went to Palestine, and she basically would put on, there would be big sirens when the bulldozers from the Israeli military were coming to bulldoze Palestinian homes. That was her call, to go put on a big, bright, fluorescent orange vest and literally stand in between the homes and the bulldozers, because she was trying to stop these Israeli bulldozers from literally obliterating these homes, with families inside the homes, by the way. And I found this so compelling, in part because it was really about her body. Remember my sort of very depressing fantasy about lighting my own body on fire? Part of that was about, I had looked around and I had learned my body somehow, and for very unjust reasons, matters more than other people's. The fact that I'm a white, privileged woman matters more. And that's where my instinct had come from, right? And what Rachel Corrie recognized was similarly that there was a whole family of Palestinians in this home, but if she put her body in between the home and the bulldozer, it seemed to matter more. Well, it turned out it didn't matter more. She was actually run over by one of those bulldozers. And you know, the sort of court cases continue to try to unpack how that happened, why it happened. But at 23 years old, she was crushed by a 49-ton Caterpillar bulldozer. I think what's so important about Rachel's story is that the other thing I should say, because it's a really important piece, is she really became this symbol, this figurehead that was being torn apart by two different factions. So after she died, Palestinians basically adopted her as a martyr and said, you know, she understood our cause, she died for our cause. Israelis held her up as a symbol of basically ignorance, that she didn't know what she was getting into, and she was a stupid girl. And in between those two basically manipulations, from my perspective, of who she really was, are her words, which I just read to you. And if you get a chance to read, she has a book, a compilation of her words that was put out by Norton, that is just stunning. And it really speaks to the real loss of her death, which is that this woman was so thoughtful at such a young age. And through her death, she was turned into sort of propaganda for both sides of an issue that obviously is incredibly intractable. But what she does teach us is that we must take global suffering personally. What I believe, in retrospect, she didn't get right necessarily was how to plug into, how to sort of catalyze that taking of global suffering personally. But she does teach us that we are all interconnected, right? That we have something to do with that 49-ton Caterpillar bulldozer, just as we have something to do with the family of people in that Palestinian home. It doesn't mean that the wisest action was to put her body in between the two of them, but that we all have some connection to that global suffering. And actually, the students and I this morning were talking a lot about this in terms of consumption, right? The clothes we wear, the things we consume, and who is connected through the labor chain to those particular choices that we're making, seemingly in a vacuum, but not in a vacuum at all. The next person I want to tell you about is Marisela Guzman. Marisela is an amazing young woman who was actually the daughter of immigrants, Mexican immigrants. She had a job from the time she was 14, and she was one of those young women who was always translating for her parents who didn't speak English very well. Her dad washed dishes in a hotel, and her mom worked in a makeup factory. And so she was the one negotiating all of the sort of things that families have to negotiate in life, including a mortgage, which, very apropos of our time, turned out to be a really dangerous mortgage for them to sign up for, and essentially forced them to lose their home. because you can imagine a 13-year-old didn't totally understand the mortgage package that she was negotiating. So Marisela grew up with this deep sense of responsibility to her family, and she knew she wanted to go to college, but obviously they couldn't afford it. So she decided to join the military. She met a recruiter who explained to her that if she went into the military afterwards, she could get money for college. She flew on an airplane for the very first time, going to boot camp from LA, and she actually loved the military. She was a very physical woman, so she really loved the physical challenge of being in boot camp. But about 2 weeks into her experience in boot camp, she was doing a night watch, which is supposed to sort of simulate what would happen if you were in the battlefield and people had to stay up all night and kind of keep a lookout. And she was actually sexually assaulted by one of her own superiors, which, as many of you are probably aware by now, military sexual assault is just this rampant issue in the military right now. And importantly, actually, Sundance is, the Sundance Film Festival is this week. How many of you saw Invisible War, which was at the Sundance Film Festival a year ago? So a few of you, if you haven't seen it, it's another depressing documentary that my family loves, but one that actually you don't leave feeling powerless. You really leave feeling galvanized. I don't know if other folks who saw it felt that way, but it's a really important documentary. And importantly, I'm telling you a story about a woman, but one of the untold stories about military sexual assault is how many men are victims of military sexual assault. So it gives this very comprehensive, important view on the issue. In any case, Marisela tried to go report what had happened to her to one of her superiors and wasn't able to. And I'm just going to read a quick passage to you of what happened. Eventually, feeling on the edge of a nervous breakdown, she decided to tell her supervisor. She turned the knob on his office door and opened it, blurting out, "I need to speak with you." He stood slowly with a menacing look on his face. "Drop and give me 20. In her haste to finally speak the truth, Marisela had forgotten the appropriate Navy policy for approaching a supervisor. Knock on door, stand at attention, request to speak. She did 20 push-ups, tears beginning to fill her eyes. "Now get up and approach again," he shouted. Marisela stood but couldn't move. She was frozen. Her supervisor's voice got louder, his tone more enraged. "Do you think I have all day? Drop and give me another 20. She did. This time the tears fell out of her eyes, splashing on the floor below. She stood. "You figure out how to do it right now?" he asked, just inches from her face. Again, she couldn't move. There is a procedure. His words at this point became indecipherable to Marisela. It was as if her mind was systematically shutting down, her emotions taking over. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She saw his hand drop, pointing at the floor, and knew to drop and give him another 20. When she stood, he stared at her in disgust for a few long seconds and then motioned toward the door. She turned on her heel and walked out. Marisela wouldn't attempt to tell another soul about her rape for 8 years. So she had this journey through the military, but eventually the moment 8 years later when she was finally able to tell the truth about what happened to her was not surprisingly a moment when she was surrounded by other women veterans who were sharing their own stories. And what she understood from that breakthrough experiences was that she wanted to create that opportunity for other women. So she co-founded something called the Service Women's Action Network, which is now an organization that helps women all over the country deal not just with military sexual assault, but all of the variety of issues that come up around women now serving in the military. And she's really a lesson to us that self-interest is at the heart of some of the most inspired activism, right? So often we think we should look far outside of ourselves, but many of us, no matter what our demographic background, have experienced suffering that we can answer by trying to prevent someone else from experiencing that suffering. And that requires truth-telling. It requires really courageous truth-telling like the kind Marisela did, often in community. And that's one of the things that's so powerful about her story and what was able to help her kind of come out about what she'd experienced. I am going to try to show you a video now. Let's see.
For so long, I kept this a secret, and I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I was crazy, and so I didn't know how to express what was happening to me. When I came to the realization of I have post-traumatic stress disorder because of the trauma that I dealt with, and I was asking for services and help. I became homeless because of this trauma. I realized that the system was broken and wasn't really taking care of their vets. I was raped in the military, and when I actually went to speak out, I wasn't allowed to talk about it. So there was this anger that was built around what happened to me, but what was happening to others. And this is just a system where you're very dispensable. Once you're injured, you're not used anymore, and you become a veteran. People talk about the military as such a big system, but for me, I'm not there to break the system. I'm there to educate people who want to go into the system and know that these are the problems. Once you're aware of something and you have the information, it's easier for you to know how to deal with it afterwards. I wish I didn't have to deal with this trauma. I wish that I didn't have to go through this, but I do. And in order for me to survive and understand what I'm going through, I have to fight this. Not for myself, but for the other women and other men who are dealing with this problem. Because, you know, I want this to end here. And if it takes me for the rest of my life to do this, then I will do it.
The next person I want to tell you about is Emily Apt. Emily is a really interesting woman because she actually grew up with a lot of privilege. She grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she also grew up listening to hip hop music, which is another really interesting thing about this generation, and I think is sort of a new spin on something that's happened many generations in the past, which is through the experience of music and lyrics, we get a cultural experience of suffering, even if we are from a very privileged family. So that's essentially sort of the water that Emily grew up in. She went to NYU. She got involved in the Women's Center, got really galvanized by that. And she decided when she graduated, she wanted to do the most helpful thing she could possibly think of, help the worst off people she could think of. So she decided she was going to be a caseworker in the welfare system in New York City. And when you listen to Emily talk about this, you see the light literally drain out of her face. She hated the work. And not only did she hate the work, but she realized she was really bad at it, in part because she hated it, right? These things are not separate. And she also realized that she was experiencing all of this jealousy. She would hear all these stories about friends of hers who were doing different kinds of projects out in the world, and she would get really jealous. And finally, she had this sort of breakthrough conversation with a friend of her big brother's who said, "You're not doing anyone any favors doing work that you hate. You're not doing yourself a favor, and you're especially not doing the clients that you're supposed to be helping a favor." And it was a light bulb moment for her where she realized she really needed to pursue a path that was not only about serving others, but about making herself light up, right? Many times, particularly privileged young people will come to social change with a sort of martyred perspective of, I need to do this because this is the most important thing, when in fact they're not very good at it because they don't like it anyway. So what Emily did, which was ingenious, is she decided to make a film about the welfare system. She'd always wanted to work in film. So she made this incredible film. This was during Bill Clinton's presidency, about the ways in which welfare was changing. And it was pivotal in affecting how people understood the real human face of what was being called welfare mothers in sort of this abstract, dehumanizing way. She's gone on to make many films, including one that premiered here at Sundance 2 years ago, interestingly, and has really found out that the best thing she can do is put her love of filmmaking to this in the service of telling real stories about social issues. Her lesson for me is to be an activist these days does not mean being a martyr, right? That if you hate something, you're probably not good at it, and you're probably not serving people very well. And it connected me with one of my favorite quotations, which is to find where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. And I really learned from Emily and others that is at that intersection that we do our most powerful work in the world, where our deep gladness meets the world's deep need. It also reminds me of another of my favorite quotes, which is, don't ask what the world needs, ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go do that, because the world needs more people who have come alive. This morning I was talking to one of the students about her work, a range of work actually of community engagement, and sort of what made her come alive the most. And when you ask people that question, you literally see the light behind their eyes. You literally see the light behind their eyes, because we all know the moments when we feel most alive, we feel most useful, literally. And we need to do that more of the time. The next person I want to tell you about is Nia Martin Robinson. Interestingly, many of the people I contacted for this book, I would call them up and say, you know, I'm reporting this book about young people in activism. I'm interested in potentially profiling you. And literally every person would say to me, except for Nia, no, you don't want to profile me. You should really profile my friend, or you should really profile my colleague. I haven't done anything special, which is very endearing and humble, of course. But Nia Martin Robinson said, yes, this is my Oprah moment. And I was like, I'm very curious about this woman. I got to keep hanging out with her because I found that so intriguing. Nia grew up in Detroit, Michigan, the daughter of two civil rights activists. And she, very interestingly, got more and more attracted to issues of climate change, environmental degradation, et cetera, which totally puzzled her parents. They were kind of like, Nia, what are you talking about, all this hippie stuff? What is all this green stuff? We don't understand. This is about racial equality. Well, what Nia essentially did was she reframed so much of the civil rights movement that her parents had been involved in for them as environmental justice causes in their own way, right? Martin Luther King's sanitation workers boycott was an environmental justice issue in many ways. And in fact, those who are most affected by climate change tend to be vulnerable people, women and children in the developing world, right? So many people of color being affected by climate issues. But for too long, we've thought about climate as, you know, a hippie issue, a white people, elite people, conservationists, sort of all those stereotypes. And Nia will be the first person to tell you that she does not go anywhere without a working toilet, right? This is not a woman who is willing to camp or do anything like that. So she's really not your typical kind of environmental stereotype, but she was so attracted to these issues because she saw kids in her own community with very severe asthma and other illnesses that she knew was related to the factories around, the quality of the air, the access to healthy food, all of these environmental issues. And I love that Nia is reframing this for her parents because they've kind of come along now and they're seeing the ways in which she's basically acting at the intersections of all these things they cared about in new ways that they didn't even realize existed. And Nia's lesson is we're recasting the past and reclaiming our legacies, right? She's not rejecting the incredible civil rights history from which she is a benefactor, but she is really pointing out that there are new ways to look at these things. There are new intersectional ways to tackle them. The other person I want to tell you about is Raul Diaz. Raul is an incredibly special human being. He's the kind of person that you meet and you just immediately know he is in the right place, doing the right thing in the world. He actually grew up in Boyle Heights in East LA during the 90s, when there was really a lot of gang violence going on. I don't know if folks remember this, but there was a lot of gang violence and there was a lot of rhetoric from politicians trying to get votes, talking about how they were going to get these super predators, which was sort of the language that was used at the time. Meanwhile, super predators were 14-year-old kids like Raul who got mixed up in drugs and violence and other things because they had no other, what sociologists call compelling projects, right? They needed families, they needed something to do after school, they needed some sense of meaning in their lives, and there was sort of this built-in social network called a gang that was providing all those things. Well, Raul was one of 8 boys, the youngest of 8 boys, being raised by a single mother, and something miraculous happened for him. He was basically kind of adopted, mentored by a man named Father Greg Boyle. Has anyone heard of Father Greg Boyle? Yeah, he's an incredible man. Jesuit priest who came into Boyle Heights and basically engaged the mothers of the community and said, what can we do to help these kids? You're their moms. I know you care more than anyone else. You tell me. And the mom said, we need to give these kids jobs. They need something to do after school. They need something to build their own agency and make them feel like they have meaning. So Father Greg Boyle started something called Homeboy Industries that essentially trains young women and young men in a bunch of different skills. And Raul grew up under his wing and became a prison reentry social worker. So all those kids that at 14 and 15 were going into prison who are now getting out at 20 because they all got these very severe sentences because of all the politicking at the time are coming out and they have to make a life for themselves, which is hard to wrap your mind around when you think about those critical adolescent years, imagining spending from the time you're 14 to like the time you're 20 in prison, where you can't have any natural relationships with people, you're not developing real life skills. It's an incredibly vulnerable position to be in when you get out. And Raul is essentially like every one of their big brother, father, mother, whatever they need, he is there to do that for them. And he's embedded in the community because he grew up in the community. He's really a natural at what he does. If you walk into Homeboy Industries, which I hope you all get a chance to do, it's in LA, you have to visit it. It's like the most amazing place in the world. You can learn how to install solar panels over there. You can get your tattoo removed over there. You can learn how to parent and meditate up there. And there's just all these amazing people walking around, making each other feel at home, welcoming each other. All of your needs, essentially, from the economic to the social, are met in this one place that this Jesuit priest is created, but that the community has continued to sort of foster and further. There's also a place called Homegirl Cafe, which is like the best food, and that's where people are getting sort of service training. So it's just this incredible example of what one can do by working with the community, working in particular with the mothers in the community. And Raul, again, is just this totally self-taught guy. He never went to social work school. He doesn't have any formal training, but he is the most equipped social worker I've ever seen. I actually watched him at one point helping this young man who just got out of prison, who was he wanted to become a fireman, and he needed to find where he could get boots to go to a training because he needed these fire boots. And he had never used the internet before. And, you know, this is a digital native generation, right? This kid is 19 years old and he's sitting in front of the computer and he is struggling like hell to figure out what is this navigation bar. He didn't know any of it. And I was sitting there ready to jump out of my seat and do everything for him. And Raul is just like calm as a cucumber. Just let that kid struggle and figure it out on his own. And of course he found how to get those boots. And of course that was exactly what he needed to do, was struggle through that experience. And that's the kind of like intuitive wisdom that I watched Raul bring to his work that was so powerful. For me, he's a lesson that we are rehumanizers, right? We have to have this systemic study of what we do. But on the most basic level, if you can be someone within a dehumanizing system who makes someone else feel witnessed, who makes someone else feel dignified, that is a massive gift. That is a massive use of your energy to make one person feel like they are seen as a human being within a system that is otherwise dehumanizing. And for Raul, of course, that was the prison system, that was the legal system, that was the education system, all of these systems that these kids are a part of that basically repeatedly tell them that they're less than human. Raul is there to say, your needs matter to me, your skills matter to me. And to me, that was the most moving thing to witness. Rosario Dawson, how many people know who she is? Okay, so she's an actor. She's currently dating Danny Boyle, I just learned yesterday, who's like some fancy, famous British director. But she's a fascinating character because she has basically traveled from the least economic, sort of the poorest economic situation in this country to the highest, most wealthy economic situation in this country in one very still short lifetime, right? She's 33 years old. She was discovered on her stoop at 15. She was living in the Lower East Side in a building where she and her family were squatting, essentially, which means no one owned the deeds to the building. They just sort of moved in. It was abandoned. Her mom did the plumbing, which I love. Her mom is like a larger-than-life character. She did all the plumbing in the building. Her dad did the carpentry, and it was just a big community of people who all took care of each other, and kind of everyone ran up and down the stairs. So she literally grew up in, squatting in this home in Lower East Side, discovered on her stoop at 15 years old by a director and put into her first movie, which is called Kids, and basically has not stopped starring in Hollywood movies ever since. She was with Will Smith in that movie 7 Pounds and sort of has become this Hollywood figure. And yet her own upbringing was so rooted in activism. Not an activism born out of privilege, but an activism of like, we are together, a community, we need things, right? This guy's got HIV AIDS, how do we help him? This person, needs help figuring out how to navigate the healthcare system. How do we help them? This person is in domestic abuse situation. How do we help her? So it was sort of an activism born of community and born of interdependence. So Rosario has this interesting challenge of not having the sort of, what do I do with too little, but what do I do with too much, right? All of a sudden she has traveled the full economic spectrum possible in this country, and she has to figure out how to do authentic work in the world. And so she really taught me activism is not always about grappling with a lack of power, but sometimes it's about facing an excess of it, right? How do you authentically leverage your power when you're someone who, because of life and circumstance and some hard work and lots of luck, ends up with a bunch of power. She's gone on to co-found something called Voto Latino, which is trying to mobilize young Latinos to register to vote. She's also on the board of V-Day, which is Eve Ensler's organization that's fighting gender-based violence. She's sort of got her hands in a million different things. She's interested in absolutely everything. And just a very powerful example of what it means to actually leverage celebrity in an authentic way. I really wanted to tackle celebrity, although almost everyone in this book is just sort of an ordinary, extraordinary person from my perspective. I did want to tackle celebrity because I think this generation tends to be sort of obsessed with it. And I wanted to look at her in a really humanized way. And there was no public relations people. It was really just her and I having these conversations in a really vulnerable, open way. Tyrone Boucher. So Tyrone is another person who is really was really forced to grapple with an excess of power. In his case, it came in the form of a trust fund. When Tyrone was 18 years old, he was told that he was going to inherit $400,000 on his 18th birthday, and basically wanted to run away from it, right? Most people hear this and they think, I would love a trust fund, right? Give me $400,000. I know exactly what I would do with it. Tyrone had grown up with this very radical consciousness, and it was the last thing he wanted. So he basically decided, I'm not even going to acknowledge that this exists. I'm just going to, it's in a bank account somewhere. I'm not even going to think about it. Went to Stanford University, dropped out halfway through his first semester, and started traveling the world and the country in particular as kind of one of these like vagabond kids, right? He had a crew of other kids, kind of anarchist politics, eating pizzas that had been thrown out in Domino's and Pizza Hut trash cans, like really living off the land, living together, using very little money. So at some point along this journey, the crew of people that Tyrone was with started to talk about race. And Tyrone got really excited about that conversation. He was like, yeah, there's so much white privilege, so much racism still exists, and really getting galvanized and galvanized. And then someone said something about class. And all of a sudden, Tyrone's heart kind of dropped because he realized, you know, I cannot pretend to be authentic and radicalized and care about race if I'm not acknowledging that class is a deeply embedded part of it. And I'm this kid eating out of trash cans when I have a $400,000 trust fund sitting in a bank account somewhere that I'm pretending doesn't exist. So it sent Tyrone on this really interesting intellectual journey of learning about class, learning about race, learning how these things are intersected, and led him to discover something called Resource Generation, which is an organization that is essentially helping rich kids come out, because many of them are the kind of folks who are eating pizza out of trash cans trying to pretend they don't have a trust fund, and actually get together and problematize, talk about the complexity of what it means to inherit wealth, right? Because for those of us who don't have it, it seems ridiculous, right? We think, what's complicated about that? You get to have money. But for people who are inheriting that wealth, for many of them, it feels like they had nothing to do with it. And here they are put in this position of such greater privilege than everyone around them who they love dearly and want to take care of. And it creates all of these questions about, if people know, what will they think of me? Will they become friends with me for this reason? How do I navigate all of that? So people actually clam up about it. A lot of young people do not talk about their own struggles around this question. So Resource Generation has basically come in and used the same principles of community organizing, but applied it to questions of class. And interestingly, when I hung out with all these Resource Generation folks, all of a sudden I was like, so many of these kids are queer, or in Tyrone's case, questioning their gender identity. Tyrone was born in a female body, but identifies as male. And I asked Tyrone about that. I said, what is this intersection about? What do you think is going on here? And he said, basically, people who have had one form of discrimination in their family, in their neighborhoods, in their schools, wake up to the idea that other forms of discrimination exist. So if you've been made fun of because you're queer, all of a sudden you think about what it would be like to be made fun of because you're poor, or not have access to places because you're poor. So that was a really interesting moment for me of kind of unlocking how these things are all related. And Tyrone is really invested now in what he calls social justice philanthropy, which, as opposed to some other forms of kind of top-down charity, is about creating real, genuine relationships between the people with the money, which is one tool, and the people in the community doing the work with the tool of knowing those communities with that kind of resource. So it's really sort of trying to equalize the playing field and create these genuine relationships. Last person I want to tell you about, Dina Simmons. Dina is a 7th grade teacher in the Bronx, or was when I wrote this piece about her. And I found her because I asked a friend of mine who is a teacher, who is the most talented young teacher you've ever seen in a classroom? And without skipping a beat, he said, Dina Simmons. I was like, all right, you were really sure about that. You didn't waffle at all. How do I meet this woman? So he introduced us. I called Dina. I said, can I come hang out in your classroom? She's a little skeptical, but she was like, all right. So I show up and I enter this world that Dina has created that was unlike any classroom I've ever been in. Keep in mind, she is teaching in the poorest congressional district in the country, the poorest congressional district in the country. And I walked in and she was doing a math lesson, and in the middle of the math lesson, some, 13-year-old kid yells out, "I love you, Miss Simmons." And she's like, "I love you too. Now back to this triangle. Here's how geometry works." And it was really stunning. There were things all over the wall about love and about community and friendship. And these kids took to it. They didn't think it was cheesy. They knew that Miss Simmons not only was from the Bronx, but understood what they were dealing with and was going to create this sort of community, this sort of utopia of love in a place that was otherwise a pretty rough place to grow up. In fact, Dina grew up in the Bronx. She was one of 3 girls. She was actually an identical twin. So she's Dina Simmons, and she has a sister named Dina Simmons. And Dina and Dana and Shayna, the 3 sisters, and the single mother all grew up in a 1-bedroom apartment. So she not only grew up with Dana, but she shared a bed with Dana for 18 years. And Dana had abdominal migraines growing up, which is a very rare disease. So Dina spent a lot of time on sort of the floor of hospital waiting rooms, watching her sister not get the health care she deserved. She also grew up hearing her mom rant about the importance of education. So you can think about these sort of 2 lines, education and health were sort of coming up for Dina. She actually went to Middlebury College, and she came back to the Bronx as a Teach for America fellow, which is very rare for Teach for America to have someone who's actually from the community teaching in the community. So she came back, and she is just this incredible teacher who did so much for her students. She was always obsessed with these intersections of health and education, because she would sit in her classroom and she knew no matter how well I teach these kids, if they're depressed, if they can't stay awake because they didn't get sleep last night, if they didn't have a proper breakfast, I can never overcome those specific issues. So she's actually left the classroom. She's getting an EDD, which is the equivalent of a PhD in education, in those intersections of health and education. And she wants to go back into the classroom and do something about what she sees as that really holistic issue. But I'll tell you, one of the moments when I truly understood the depth of her power was she decided to take this entire classroom of kids to Middlebury College to show them, and remember, these are 7th graders, what a college looked like, to say to them, you deserve to be on a campus like this someday. I want you to hold this in your minds. So she invited me to go along, and I was like, yeah, this will be great reporting opportunity. She says, we're going to leave at 6:30 a.m. on Saturday, so you need to meet us in front of the school. I'm like, oh, because I live in Brooklyn. Like, Brooklyn to the Bronx is like a 2-hour train ride. I'm like, all right. So I'm thinking as I get ready and I'm grumpy and it's the morning, I'm like, there's no way these kids are going to be there at 6:30 in the morning. So it's okay if I'm a little bit late. So I show up with my coffee and, my hoodie over my head with this really grumpy look on my face. And I get to the front of the school, and there are 25 kids in their Sunday best lined up ready to go. And it was such a profound indication of the ways in which Dina motivated these kids to feel like they owned these opportunities and they were going to show up for them. And seeing these kids, who many of which had never left New York City, navigate the Middlebury campus. How many of you have ever been on the campus? It's like this green palatial place. There was one moment where the guy was, one of the students, this like blonde and like this, kind of typical Middlebury outfit, gave them a tour. And at the end, he said, like, do you guys have any other questions? They were like, could we take a picture with you? Like, he was like a zebra in a zoo or something to them. Like, we were like, we have never seen someone like you. It was really amazing to watch. And you could tell the way Dina talked to them and sort of prepared them, they just felt like they belonged there, which is, I think, just an incredibly powerful, by the way, she paid for all of this out of her own pocket, the bus to get there and all of that stuff. So she's just an incredible human being. And she's actually given a TEDx talk, which I so recommend that everyone watch when they get home. It's just so moving. And she talks about bullying, and she's writing about bullying right now. So another thing, we're fiercely intersectional in our analysis, right? Dina could never look at education separate from health, just as Nia couldn't look at race separate from environment, just as Tyrone couldn't look at race separate from class, right? All of these things are rooted together. In my favorite John Muir quote, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we usually find it's hitched to everything else in the universe, right? And so this is what I want to leave you with. I think this generation has really been stereotyped as being apathetic, right? There's books called Generation Me, why today's young Americans are more confident, assertive, entitled, and more miserable than ever before. Tom Friedman from the New York Times dubbed us Generation Q for quiet in the pages of the New York Times. He wrote, Generation Q may be too quiet, too online for its own good and for the country's own good. And in my experience, it seems like morning shows can never resist the opportunity to talk about Generation Y in the workplace and how like horrible they are to work with because they're so kind of lazy and entitled. So I really want to reframe all of that. I think what some people are seeing as apathetic or lazy or entitled is really about overwhelm. I think this generation has been raised in a time where we're just aware of the deep complexities of every move we make, every product we buy, every activity we decide to get involved in, every word we write. And it's paralyzing in many ways. And I think it creates what I experienced personally, which was that kind of swing between pride and despair. But I think if we can reframe it and we can talk about that swing, if we can talk about what Parker Palmer calls that whiplash, that we can embrace the imperfection of what social change actually looks like. Parker Palmer, who's a writer I've been deeply influenced by, has a book called Let Your Life Speak, and he writes, absolutism and relativism have ravaged not only the things of the world, but our sense of the knowing self as well. We are whiplash between an arrogant overestimation of ourselves and a servile underestimation of ourselves. But the outcome is always the same, a distortion of the humble yet exalted reality of the human self, a paradoxical pearl of price. I love that. I don't know why this is screwing up, but this is Cornel West, which you can't see here. I found this wonderful documentary, this one not depressing, called Examined Life while I was working on this book, where this woman interviews philosophers about different parts of life. And one of the things Cornel West says in this clip is, he says, of course it's a failure, but how good a failure is it? And to me, that spoke so deeply to what I was witnessing among these incredible human beings I'd had the privilege of hanging out with. Did Raul succeed in making sure every kid didn't go back into prison? No, sometimes he failed. But he failed really well when that kid knew that someone on earth cared about them, even if they ended up going back to prison, right? Did Nia, protect Detroit from all of these sort of environmental degradations? No. Every day was complex. Every day was a struggle. But she managed to teach her parents, to teach her peers that environmental issues were racial justice issues, right? And that in itself was a great failure, even if she couldn't sort of quote unquote save Detroit. There are all of these ways in which these people failed repeatedly, daily, but they always tried to fail better than the time before. And they always tried to fail in a way that really humanized the other people around them, in a way that honored their own integrity. And so for me, that became sort of a mantra of good failure. How can I fail better all the time? Rebecca Solnit says, all revolutions fail because they set their sights heaven high, but none of them fail to do something. And it may sound like a cop-out, but having been around now past that 2002 graduation moment when I talked about walking across that stage, I have much deeper respect than ever before for just doing something, right? For the idea that if you have a good heart and a good intention and you go out there and try to be of service to people in a thoughtful, self-aware way, that's the most important thing you can do, even if you fail. If you create relationships out of that, if you humanize, dehumanizing systems out of that, it will be deeply important to somebody. And what could be more important? This is the crew. I actually got them together when the book was about to come out, and they all met each other and had this incredible weekend and got pretty goofy by the end of it. So I'll leave that up as I read this final passage to you. The strangest thing happened on the way to my 30s. I realized that I wasn't going to live forever. And it made the prospect of paralysis, the option of overthinking and wallowing in my own disillusion about what I'd been told, in contrast to what I was observing and experiencing, all seem like a whole lot of wasted time. Certainly there is need for reflection, research, self-examination, before we just jump too enthusiastically into, quote, doing good. But we are also a generation with a tendency to stew. We've learned how to analyze well, perhaps too well, thanks to our curricula and critical thinking and our hardworking teachers. We can intellectualize any solution into tatters with our finely sharpened swords of cultural relativity. And it's honorable that we've got these skills and that we're not afraid to use them. But as George Jackson says, patience has its limit. Take it too far, and it's cowardice. We must be fearless in our analysis and our action. We must accept that we will fail and try anyway. Try to fail always more exquisitely, more honestly, more effectively. We must wake up in the morning naively believing in the power of our own dreams and the potential of our own gifts, and go to bed exhausted and determined to do it all over again with maybe just a little bit of a different tactic, a little less ego, a little more help. What else are you going to do? Give up? Of course you're not. You're not going to do that because you're part of a long line of people who didn't do that. Because you live in a country that was actually founded on the assumption that you would be audacious and rebellious and inexhaustible in your pursuit of the more perfect union. You're not going to settle because you've seen how that kills people, how resigning and consuming and forgetting are surefire ways to deaden a soul. You're not going to give up because it would be terribly boring. You're not going to give up because you owe the world, this nation, yourself, bravery in the face of suffering, vision in the face of stagnancy, and blood, sweat, and tears in the face of injustice. The good failure is your debt for being here, now, in this beautiful, horrible place. We have the opportunity to live our lives consciously in spite of all the soporific influences, to act even when we know how complex the prospect of doing so is. Our charge is not to save the world, after all. It's to live in it, flawed and fierce, loving and humble. As children of the 80s and 90s, we are uniquely positioned to fail. The bureaucracy we face, the scale of our challenges, the intractable nature of so many of our most unjust international institutions and systems, all of these add up to colossal potential for disappointment. But no matter, we must strive to make the world better anyway. We must struggle to make our friendships, our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, and our nation more dignified, knowing that it might not work, and struggling anyway. We must dedicate ourselves each and every morning to being the most kind, thoughtful, courageous human beings who ever walked the earth, and know that it still won't be enough. We must do it anyway. Thank you very much.